Will you join me in prayer? Gracious God, hear our joyful song. Know that the joy that you bring to us can guide us and keep us strong even when there are dark days ahead. Just like Jesus, who came through the locked door, let your Spirit move through us. Amen. It was Easter Sunday, and the pews were completely full. The music was wonderful. The sermon was short but powerful. The children were all decked out in their Easter best and on their very best behavior. At the end of the service, the pastor was standing at the door as she always does, ready to shake hands and to greet the congregation. Just as John was walking out of the sanctuary, the pastor pulled him aside and said, "John, you need to join the army of the Lord." And John replied, "Pastor, I'm already in the army of the Lord." The pastor haughtily responded to him and said, "Then how come I only see you at Christmas and Easter?" Responding back, John whispered, "Well, Pastor, I guess I'm in the Secret Service." I have another joke for you. A Sunday school teacher was bringing her Sunday school class back into the worship for communion. And she stopped them at the door and she said, "Class, why is it necessary that you be quiet during this time in church?" One of the kids stands up and responds immediately, "Well, it's because everyone's asleep." Welcome to the first Sunday after Easter. Even though we have only just started our Easter journey, the celebratory season, this Sunday is a Sunday that is known throughout the entire Christian world as one of the slowest, most lackluster, most boring, and low-energy services of the entire liturgical year. And I'm very glad you made it today. When Dr. Don declared that today would be Associate Pastor Sunday, which is, I might add, potentially the highest designation anyone could offer, I declared that today would be different. It would not be your traditional low Sunday service with easy hymns for a small crowd or in a fluffy and instructive message. From this point on in the history and the future of Church of the Beatitudes, low Sunday would be low no more. Instead, we're going to delve into one of the greatest traditions, one that is rooted in the writings of the great patriarchs of the church, Augustine and Gregory of Nyssa. Today we'll celebrate the tradition of Bright Sunday, of Holy Humor Sunday, a Sunday of laughter and of joy. Now, Bright Sunday is an interesting tradition that originated in practice in the 15th century Bavaria, modern-day Germany. And on Sundays during the Easter season, the priests would descend from the chancel and walk amongst the people. They would tell jokes and share humorous stories about the church that would evoke what is known as risus paschalis, or the Easter laugh. And in that tradition, I have a few funny worship stories to share with you. Have I ever told you, I know I've told some of you this story, but have I ever told you about my very first baptism? It's awesome. As a seminary student, I was serving this tiny little church, and we didn't have baptisms all that often. My whole time there, we just had this one baptism. This woman came into the church, and if I came from any other brand of Christianity, I have to say whatever happened that day, she was saved. She was saved. It was a holy experience from top to bottom. She walked into the church. She had no faith community to speak of, no sense of what Christianity was about. But when she left my little space, she knew she was following in the way of Christ, and she demanded to be baptized. The Holy Spirit was moving. So when the time came for her baptism, we stood before the congregation on Sunday morning, this first baptism they'd had in forever, and we shared the sacred words of covenant and commitment, and we pledged to take her in to this beloved community. And so as I raised this heavy pitcher up above my head to pour the water into the baptismal font, I realized the pitcher was stone cold dry, completely empty. Completely empty. And there are moments in your life, I realized then, when all you can do is laugh. There is no walking away from that moment. You just have to laugh. And it was beautiful, because on that day, she wasn't baptized by sacred water. She was baptized by this deep belly laughter, not just from me, but from everyone there. That's the Risus Paschalis. That's the Easter laugh. It's the resurrecting force that is so desperately needed after the austerities of Lent and Holy Week. And it even makes liturgical sense. Laughter and joy are the best way to mark what Augustine referred to as the ultimate joke of the universe. That is, Jesus' amazing and miraculous triumph over the forces of evil and death. And I have to say that celebrating Holy Humor Sunday sort of flies in the face of traditional customs and expectations, and really tries to buck some significant cultural trends. Humor, after all, is often left out of our worship services. There are so many places in which jokes and humorous stories are considered completely not sacred. And in fact, this tradition of Risus Paschalis was banned by Pope Clement X because people were having way too much not-so-sacred fun in church. In the main line, and even in the UCC, we value the intellectual and the ethereal. But we often overlook the sensations of the body, the ways in which the divine moves through us in uncontrollable laughter, and the sacredness of the joy that comes with dancing in the aisles moved by the music, even though you may just trip over your two left feet, like I do. The book of Zephaniah reminds us that God is with us in that joy. God is with us and is happy to be with us. In fact, God laughs when we laugh. And yet there are moments in our lives when laughter doesn't come easily. There's a joke that kind of hits pretty close to home, and it goes like this: what's the best way to make God laugh? Tell God your plans. Things in life change in a moment. All of the best laid plans, all of our hopes and our dreams and our expectations and desires can fall to pieces in just a drop of the hat. And while today is Bright Sunday, it's not so much a bright Sunday for everyone. There are those of us that come from high church traditions. That's our recovering Catholics and our closet Episcopalians who I know walk amongst us. They might recognize today as Octave Sunday, which is another Sunday in the liturgical year. Octave refers to that 8-day period between the joyous celebration of Easter Sunday and the resurrection and where we are today, with the disciples in the locked room who are huddling in fear and uncertainty. It's 8 days into the season of Easter, and we're not celebrating anymore. Now, you can imagine what the disciples must have been feeling on those days immediately after the crucifixion of Jesus. Their friend had just been killed by the authorities in a horrifying and graphic manner. The riotous crowds were still filled with the bloodlust, and yet entirely capable of dispensing that violent will on those gathered in the upper room, as they showed to Jesus himself. The fear that the disciples must have been feeling would not have been quelled by the disappearance of Jesus' body from the tomb. For the joy and the celebration that Mary Magdalene and the women understood was not real for the men. They had not seen the risen Christ. And the mysterious circumstances around his disappearance would not have been much of a comfort, especially with the possibility of sabotage and desecration on their memory. Jesus, of course, had been mocked and bound and abused on the cross. And so it would not have been unbelievable that the sick humor of the malicious crowds would have continued after his death. So there they were, on a day just like this, grieving and afraid, their anxiety increasing minute after minute after minute. What are we going to do? But they say that the darkest hour is before the dawn and that resurrection comes in the morning. Who's going to walk in that door but Jesus himself? If you take a moment to read this passage from John, it's actually pretty hilarious. It's a humorous encounter. And it's one with perfect comedic timing. In fact, it's something like you'd see on Saturday Night Live, I think. It's a skit, almost. There were the disciples, 12 guys who were locked away in this upper room together. They were grieving, they were lost, they were unsure. And then all of a sudden, there appears Jesus right through a wall. And what does he say? Peace be with you, man. It was instantaneous. All of the days of waiting, all that rising tension, and it was dissipated in those 4 little words, peace be with you. Now, I believe that this passage was meant to be humorous, and we're not just reading that way now. It was meant to be humorous. For the disciples would have known the words of Jesus himself, who said, "Blessed are those who weep now, for you shall laugh." And in this moment, in this unexpected, illogical, and unprecedented moment, when the disciples were too full of fear to see beyond the empty tomb and that locked door, Jesus showed up ready to laugh. And I believe in the power of humor. While I do not believe that humor itself can overcome death, it can help us to remember the richness of life. And while humor cannot cure an illness, it can help overcome pain. And while humor may not get us that job or help us on that final review, it can help us to find the strength and the self-confidence to persevere no matter what. There are special moments in our lives when the unexpected and the humorous take us absolutely by surprise, when it pulls us out of the haze of our daily patterns and expectations and pushes us to a new level of understanding. Yesterday at the Beatitudes Women Retreat, we reflected on the following passage from one of the most recent UCC daily devotionals. And much like Jesus' entry into the locked room, this passage begins rather abruptly. You're gonna die. You're gonna die. Embrace it. It is said that life shrinks when death is denied. You can run from death. You can immerse yourself in the surface, diverted by screens and magazines, distracted from everything, including existence itself. Martin Heidegger called this kind of life forgetfulness of being. It's just floating along. It is in this state that most of us live most of the time. In fact, we're encouraged to. We segregate the dying and ignore the aging. We worship the altar of the youth cult. The quarterback slips, the actress ages, they get edged off for next year's model. But occasionally, something punctures this haze. Last year, I saw it happen at Costco. There was a man in front of me who was buying a large screen TV, a box of apples, a handle of vodka, and I don't know what else was in his cart. And then suddenly, he stopped. He froze and he said, "Whoa." And I looked up. And there, right in the middle of Costco, was a coffin for sale. Right in the middle of the store. Whoa. The man didn't sound upset, he sounded amazed that haze was punctured. And when the haze is punctured, life becomes intense. Everything around you is fleeting, you are fleeting. And suddenly the day shimmers. Existence becomes remarkable. It glows and it is worth diving into as deeply as possible. Heidegger said that in this state, one marvels not about the way things are, but that they are. You're going to die. I'm going to die. The clock is ticking. We have to start living right now. The theologian Richard Swanson writes, "The task on Easter, which is every Sunday in an Easter-based faith, is to tell stories about resurrection in a world where everyone dies." And I had an experience like this week. The first week of Easter, the week during which we're supposed to be celebrating the risen Christ, the one who overcame the reality of death. There was a man on our property here at the church. He lived here, and he made his home in front of the great west window. Tucked behind that low wall, it was a safe place for him. It was always tidy and well tended. During the day, he left that space, and he lived his life on his own terms. The staff here at the church and many of the congregation didn't know much about him, not even his name. But we knew that this was a place that he called his home. And he cared for it. He cared for the property, always keeping an eye out to make sure everything was okay and safe. And on the weekends and the evenings, you may have seen him cleaning up the trash and the debris on the Flynn Lane property, or around the property sweeping off the sidewalks. He never asked us for anything, and yet he gave us so much in return. He was an expected part of my life, and in the life of this church, someone I began to take for granted. Our paths would cross in routine ways, expected but not too close. Early this week, we found that he had died in his home, just outside this window, under the shining colors of the great prophets and leaders of our faith. The haze had been broken. Even in the midst of celebration, of joy and humor, there can be tragedy. And yet we know, as Easter people, that the darkest hours before the dawn and resurrection comes in the morning. We are a people that believes that life begins again and that new life should be celebrated. Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, speaks to the reality of human existence, that death and life and peace and struggle and grief and laughter are all a part of our daily life. And there is a time for all of it. For everything there is a season, a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together. And now this is a time that we prepare ourselves for prayer. And so I would invite you to lift up your hearts to the one who can hold all things.